Hi everyone, I'm Ginny Lobel with Defined Health, and we welcome you to today's Defined Health Insights Series webinar, Surfing the CNS Pipeline, Ripples, Swells, or Waves. Today's webinar will feature Ginger Johnson, CEO and CNS Practice Area Head at Defined Health, and Harry Tracy, Founder and President of NI Research and the author of NI Research's bi-monthly publication, NeuroPerspective. Today's webinar is produced and sponsored by Defined Health with co-sponsors ShareVault and Bio International. ShareVault is a leading global provider of cloud-based secure document sharing systems and virtual data rooms that organizations use for sharing highly confidential documents with external parties. Within life sciences, ShareVault is commonly used by corporate clients, research and tech transfer organizations to control and monitor activity of their very sensitive documents, especially during licensing and partnering events. Because of its product leadership and having the only system of its kind with biopharma-specific features, ShareVault is the preferred provider in the member benefits program of Bio and more than 40 other international and regional life science associations. Our co-sponsor Bio International encourages all of you to join all of us at the Bio International Convention being held June 19th through 22nd in San Diego, California. The Bio Convention attracts 16,000 biotech and pharma leaders from around the world. Bio's one-on-one partnering system makes it easy to identify potential business partners and request on-site meetings with senior business development leaders and prospective investors. For more information or to register, visit convention.bio.org. Now for the short little advertisement. To learn more about Defined Health and our early strategic commercial development services, give us a call, send us an email, or visit our website at definedhealth.com. We hope to have time to field questions at during the closing minutes of this session. Please send your questions along as you think of them. If we don't get to them in this hour, we will follow up with you directly in the next day or so. We anticipate that the slides and an audio-visual edition of this webinar will be posted on the Defined Health website within the next few days. Thank you, and please enjoy this edition of Defined Health Insight Series webinars. I will now turn it over to Ginger Johnson.
Thank you, Ginny. Ginny, did you mention cancer progress and therapeutic insight? We have up on the screen. You can look that up on our website too. And I want to just give a little bit more of an introduction to Harry before we jump into the conversation. So Harry is as Ginny said, founder president of NI Research. His publications are NeuroPerspective, which is a bi-monthly publication that catches us up on news and events focused on CNS, as well as usually 2 in-depth reviews of particular indications. Also neurolicensing and the private CNS company review. And I've heard this from many people, I really look forward to getting my email from Harry to see what he's going to be talking about, and he's great in terms of the detail and the depth, and he has a fantastic dry wit, so they're educational and entertaining all at the same time. So over the years, Harry and I have gotten to know each other and have had conversations, and had an idea that it would be good to share some of that with the broader audience. So we're trying out this webinar. It is very high level in that we're going to be touching on a lot of things. We're doing a flyover of what we see as new and exciting and really game-changing in CNS. If the people out there in webinar world like this format, I think there are several subjects that we could go deep into on subsequent webinars, so we'll ask for your feedback. The slide that is up here is Harry's slide, and it is looking into the future indications and programs that we see in the pipeline that promise to make major shifts in the treatment of multiple conditions. And this is, contrary to popular belief and what we see in the media, fake news, is that CNS is just a graveyard of failures. We are optimistic. We see a lot of interesting things coming in the future, and that's what we'll talk about today. I have, just so you know how the format's going to go, I have a couple of slides up front to set the stage. Then we have sections. Harry, I'll take the sections. I'll go back with some questions, and then at the end we'll take questions from the audience. So we have a theme here. We've characterized the CNS pipeline in terms of ripples, swells, and waves. And just to give you a brief definition, a ripple either has marginal value or has not demonstrated the likelihood of exceeding that level of value. A swell looks like it's really turning into something that has potential, but it could also be a program that will never be a true wave. As the title says, forces inherent to a potential therapy such as efficacy, safety, or tolerability data, or external influences such as regulators and payers can be a positive force, or they can diminish or stop the transition from a ripple to a swell to a wave. And a wave is meaningful clinical advancement, or what we're calling treatment paradigm shifts. So before we jump into any of the specific programs, we're going to take a step back, and Harry's going to walk through maybe 6 slides to talk through the CNS macro climate. So Harry, you just tell me when to go next. Oh, to the next slide.
Okay.
Next slide.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
All right, thank you, Ginger. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, whenever we talk about the neuro sector, it's always worth taking a look at the resourcing that's available to companies in it. Because certainly there have been many years where there wasn't enough influx of resources from either institutional investors or from partners to really generate much momentum. Now, if you look at that slide, you can see that there was a real flat line for much of the time from 2004 to 2013, and that has changed over the last 2 or 3 years. And in 2015 was a dramatic increase. Now, some of that reflected some events that aren't that likely to be replicated on a yearly basis. We had some huge financings. I count 7 that were $200 million or more. And there were 11 IPOs that averaged almost $90 million each. So 2015 in some ways was an anomaly that should not be seen as a benchmark for future years. So 2016 was down about 40% from that. Now, turning to this year, and I think I would go to the next slide. This year, obviously, there's been a fair amount of environmental chaos, which in late March, when I did a presentation at a conference, at that time, the first 3 months of the year were down about 40% just from last year. And that was somewhat worrisome. Now, April changed that. So through the first 4 months of this year, we're not down that much from 2016. So there's been some stabilization in terms of funding coming in. That was partially due to one large partnership and one large in-licensing, but still, it's not quite as worrisome as it was even a month ago. Go to the next slide. Now, one of the things that I'm always looking at is where the money is going. What kinds of neuro programs are attracting investors or partners? Now, this is a slide that somewhat deceptively tries to show where money is going in terms of partnership upfronts. And as you can see, in 2015 and 2014, there was something of an increase going into disease-modifying drugs. Those 4 categories are disease modifiers for neurodegeneration, symptomatic treatments for neurology, psychiatry, and pain. Now, there was quite a while where pharma partners were shying away from disease modifiers because it's risky and expensive, even though the potential rewards are so high. They started coming back in, but I would have to caution you that the 2017 annualized figures, where I was trying to show patterns, is somewhat deceptive because that is not a huge increase in the amount of money that is going into disease modifiers. That was one program, Biogen's in-licensing of Bristol Myers Squibb's tau antibodies. So that it would be nice if we were seeing that kind of influx of partner resources. But at this point, I think that we're going to see a continuation of a pattern where disease modifiers will be getting some attention, as will symptomatic treatments, a somewhat safer area. I think the psychiatry area is going to, well, it can't do any worse than it did in 2016 because we had no disclosed upfront payments for psychiatry partnership in 2016, so there was only one way to go, and that has shown some improvement so far this year. Next slide. Now this is the distribution of investor interest, and I think this is showing some consistency over time. There was a while, through 2013, that it was hard to get institutional investors on board for neuroscience. In 2014, the area they came back into were symptomatic treatments, things like motor deficits in Parkinson's, cognition in Alzheimer's. That has continued to be a popular area and is still the one, even in 2017 on an annualized basis, when there's attracted the most investment. But investors also started coming back into disease modifiers, realizing that this, in the long run, is where neuroscience may have the most to offer. So that is in second place. As you can see, pain is somewhat cyclical. It depends on when a few companies start to attract attention, and then it drops off. Psychiatry is still coming up last. So there's, ironically, even though, as we're going to talk about later in this presentation, even the psychiatry arguably is the context where we're making some of the most dramatic progress. It is the area where credibility is hardest to achieve with investors. Next slide. Now, I was interested to take a look at partnering emphases. Now, we track with neurolicensing the wish lists of all the major and mid-sized pharma companies when it comes to what they say they're interested in partnering. And I compared 2011 with 2016 just to see if there were any dramatic shifts in emphasis. In fact, there's a remarkable amount of consistency. Neurodegeneration has continued to be at the top of the list, although there's been a considerable increase in attention to ALS and to some degree more interest in Huntington's. There's also been a dramatic increase in interest in the neurodevelopmental disorders, and this is part of a theme where genetically defined populations, where we have more certainty as to the constitution of the population, and thus somewhat more confidence that we're at least testing therapies in the right group of people, have also attracted a lot more attention. New slide. Now, the other question is always, that for me was always begged by these partnering wish lists. And anybody who's sat in a business development meeting is used to a generally rather tedious panel where the 4 or 5 BD heads on the panel go through a roster of areas they are or are not interested in partnering. The question always is, do they mean it? Or is it public relations window dressing? Well, in fact, when we went back and took a look at the 2011 business development wish list goals for all these companies, 40% of them did translate to that company licensing or acquiring a relevant program by 2016, which is actually a better percentage than I would have expected. They were batting 400. Now, 48% of the goals in neurodegeneration were actualized, turned into a real licensing or acquisition, which shows I think the heavy focus that pharma has on neurodegeneration. 33% of goals in other areas were actualized. Interestingly, 27% of the licensing or acquisitions were in therapeutic areas that had not been cited as an interest by the in-licensing company. Now, part of that may reflect shifting strategic emphases over time, but I think it also reflects the fact that more companies are being opportunistic. Rather than defining a menu of areas where they're going to focus, they're basically trying to remain open to a wider spectrum of programs, and they basically direct their emphasis towards those that at that moment seem to have most potential. And in spite of the news, and this was fake news, that pharma was exiting from neuroscience. In fact, if anything, there is, I think, a return of pharmas, and certainly two companies that have re-emphasized CNS partnering, Sanofi and AbbVie, two companies that have not been that active in the area in recent years when it comes to partnering, are making very active returns to the area. New slide. So this is just a roster of partnerships that have been signed so far in 2017. As you can see, there are a few for which they don't disclose the upfront and milestone components. I used to say that generally did not mean good things, but in at least one of those instances, in fact, the terms are very good, but are being withheld. Then you've got a couple of partnerships, Biogen with BMS, and then Otsuka's acquisition of Neurovance, where the upfront payments are quite respectable, and the others tend to trickle down to rather small amounts. But I would point out one that I think is important, and that's Celgene, a major company in oncology with no particular history, or not much of a history in neuroscience other than acquiring Receptos. And the fact that they engaged with Evotec on a discovery screening project, I think bodes well for them becoming more active in neuroscience and bringing their resources into the area. Next slide.
Okay, so thank you, Harry. That's a great backdrop for the discussion that's to come. And you know, what I get out of it at the highest level is that the companies are sticking with neurodegeneration, the big and the smaller indications, but there's a trend to move into orphan and genetic disorders, and they're open, or tend to be opening up to more opportunistic opportunities. So, and I think that's what we'll see going forward. So let's start with our category of ripples, and I think, you know, we can touch on these probably more quickly and then spend most of our time in the waves. But we've identified three right here. Some had promise and never made it past a ripple. Some, you know, we may see them as a ripple in terms of being clinically meaningful. But Harry, you walk through these slides, and then I'll ask you a couple questions.
Well, I think the common denominator here is that, I mean, two of these programs are essentially deceased at this point, but even had they squeaked past P equals 0.05, they would not have meant that much to patients in terms of clinical utility. I'm going to start with solanezumab, you know, the Lilly program, into which they must have put more than $1 billion. And even by before the last Expedition 3 trial was started, it was pretty clear that if they got anything, it was going to be barely meaningful. And to their credit, they did just basically admit that an 11 to 15% improvement in the pace of decline was simply not going to be meaningful clinically. And they, at least at this point, some things get resurrected occasionally, but I think in this case that solanezumab is terminated. Now, Lundbeck with Otsuka had idelaperdine, the 5-HT6 receptor antagonist. They had one failure in Alzheimer's, and this is a purely symptomatic treatment that they disclosed last year. This year, they disclosed two phase 3 programs without discussing whether or not they had actually hit any of the statistical markers, but they basically said that the clinical impact was not sufficient to justify trying to go for a filing. Now, the third of these, intiperidine from Axovant, I think is the next example of a program where we may be contending with the potential disconnect between statistical significance and clinical significance. There's actually a fair amount of data on this compound that was originally developed by GSK, and the next slide shows the best of the GSK data with that particular dose of intiperidine. On that slide, you can see that the best results at 6 months showed a 2-point difference on this activities of daily living scale, which did hit statistical significance. Problem is that 2 points on that scale is not that impressive when you note that rivastigmine in their phase 3 achieved a 2.5% difference. Memantine had a 2-point difference that the FDA calls small. Even vitamin E gives you a contrast of 1.76 points. And I was just looking at some comparisons. In-home occupational therapy, there's a trial that showed a 2.34 point difference after 2 years. And I can bet that occupational therapy is cheaper than a new branded medication. So the bottom line is, I'm not sure that one can hope for much in the way of clinical impact, but if it has statistical significance, I'm sure there will be a debate about whether something is better than nothing. And the pharmacoeconomic debate and the potential resistance of payors will be interesting to track. And if the trial is successful, it may come down to how aggressively it is priced in terms of whether payers are willing to cover something whose clinical impact is marginal. Next slide.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that. I think that I completely agree with you that the delta in the endpoint is marginal, and the clinical value is marginal. But this could be a commercial wave as opposed to a clinical wave, in that just the sheer size of this patient population and the high unmet need. And I think you're right, the payers will push back because it will be a meaningful impact to the budget. So they're going to have to be very careful into how it's priced and how the patients are identified that will receive the therapy. So I agree. And then this slide is, just the question on top, clear scientific rationale behind the next two indications. So that's a question for you.
Well, I mean, there are some papers that suggest that Lewy body dementia also includes some cholinergic system deficits. There is a Lewy body mouse, and they're going on the basis of some data that I think it's more of a commercial attempt to have a plan B, that if it's developed as an adjunct in Alzheimer's, doesn't add enough impact to what is already available, that in DLB you don't have anything currently available, and they're hoping that there would at least be an alternative as a monotherapy there. But to me, it's it may be prudent to have, but it's not based on any clear evidence that it's going to be a significant impact in that disorder.
Okay. Thank you. Let's go to the Swells. We have, after this, we have a few programs that we've pulled out, but just to, well, I don't have to remind you, you know what a swell is. So we have 3 categories. This is the first one, oral acute migraine alternatives. Harry can walk through these, but I'm sure that everyone knows for the acute treatment, it's just, I don't even remember how many, probably 8 or 9 generic triptans out there, as well as over-the-counter options, all kinds of things to treat these patients. Whether they treat effectively enough or not, or are tolerated or safe for those individuals, I think is the unmet need. So you want to walk through these, and then we have a few slides on the CoLucid program.
Right. Well, I think the first slide is for the CoLucid, now owned by Lilly, or returned to Lilly since it originated there. The 5-HT1F agonist, and the major discrimination that they're trying to make, or differentiation, is that it's not a vasoconstrictive drug, and thus would be a treatment of choice for people unsatisfied with the triptans, or who has some sort of cardiovascular vulnerability. But it's, there's always a trade-off, and I think the next slide is the one that.
Yeah, this is flying back. So, did you tell me that Lilly out-licensed the CoLucid for like $1 million plus some stock? I don't know what their stock in CoLucid ended up being worth, but in terms of the cash, they sold it for $1 million and bought it back for $960 million. I'll leave it to the those who are. There you go.
Yeah. So I'll leave it to the analysts to figure out what the return was on that. But anyways.
So here's you're talking about the mechanism.
Right. So they're basically yeah. Go to the next one because I just noted that. So CoLucid and now Lilly, they've had 1 phase 3 they've completed so far, and they showed that it was efficacious, and they described the profile as acceptable. But if you look at it a little bit more closely, the efficacy, which if you take a look at the reduction of pain, you had, after a couple of hours, you had just over 30% of patients who were pain-free. And I took a look back at the first Imitrex, sumatriptan phase 3 label, and some of the trials that went into that, and they were talking about a 50 to 60% proportion of patients who were reporting no pain or mild pain. So it's not clear to me that lasmiditan actually matches up in terms of efficacy compared to the most popular triptan. And then when you look at the side effect profile, I simply superimposed on the right there the results from the original Imitrex label. The lasmiditan side effect profile actually is worse on a number of those areas. So it depends on the trade-off for, there may be some people, and I think the debate will be what population, how big a population this is, for whom the lack of vasoconstriction may be important. But for a lot of patients, there will be the deterrent of these other adverse events, which show up even more frequently than they do with the triptans. I think CoLucid claimed that 13% of migraine patients might be contraindicated when it comes to taking a triptan because of cardiovascular issues. But again, going back to the original Imitrex label, 2% of patients in the trials that led to that label reported chest pressure. So I think there is it remains to be seen, even if they are successful with the next phase 3 trial, which reports later this year, what trial population is actually going to be for which lasmiditan actually would be preferable. and that a payer will be willing to pay the price for that.
Yeah, I completely agree, and it's there's the contraindicated patients, and then there's the at-risk patients for cardiovascular issues, which can be even compounded by concomitant use of NSAIDs. So it has the potential to be a very large patient population, but clearly identifying those patients and getting access for those patients will be a challenge. I did want to make one comment on this program, though. It seems that this may have been, a smart, strategic move in that Lilly is one of the 4 that has a phase 3 anti-CGRP monoclonal in the pipeline for chronic migraine. So this gives them the ability to go out ahead of that program and, develop some relationships and make some noise. So
I agree.
Do you have any comments on that?
Well, I think the other issue is on the first slide of this group, we had the 2 oral CGRP antagonists that are also in development. Yeah. And I think this is one of these contexts where I think pricing is going to be, will come out to be an important issue. We've seen a number of new drugs where it almost seemed like there was a contest and who could price more aggressively. And like there were bragging rights associated with that. That's not going to fly, I think, in highly genericized areas where the cut point for the population that really, for which an alternative is necessary and preferable and clinically mandated is going to be very negotiable. And payers, I think, are going to be increasingly resistant to just buy into the next new option if it is priced at a far higher than the generics that they already have available.
Yes, we completely agree unless the value is clear and supported by data and pharmacoeconomics. So this is our next category of Swells and its next generation opioids, and then we have a couple of slides on the Trevena program. So give it to you, Harry.
Well, I mean, the headlines on the opioid epidemic are pervasive, and it's a genuinely huge issue. One of the, I think, ancillary efforts to address that are trying to find safer versions of opioids for pain relief. And there are 2 that are cited here, one of which is a biased mood opioid agonist that in theory has a better adverse event profile, and then you've got the CARA Therapeutics program, which is a kappa opioid agonist, so it's a different opioid pathway entirely. I think that this is the context where, let's go to the next slide, clinical results are not always as they seem. They had, and I've presented in the past on the way the press releases sometimes can be parsed multiple ways, and this is a good example of one. Trevena did announce positive top-line results from their 2 phase 3 trials, and as they announced those, look at what happened to their stock price. It plummeted. So why did good news get responded to in this way? And the answer is on the next couple of slides. First of all, they noted, and this is, I think that's their slide on the right there, they noted that efficacy was comparable to morphine, but if you look at, these are 2 pain trials. One is a bunionectomy trial, the heart tissue trial, where the dose that they are now favoring as the best balance between efficacy and side effects, the 0.35 dose, if you just eyeballing it on that chart, you can see that it gives analgesic impact in just over 60% of the patients taking it, compared to morphine, which is around 75%. Now that, I think if you're a practitioner, if you're actually involved in treating these patients, having another 12 or 13 patients out of every 100 who don't get sufficient pain relief is not an irrelevant clinical issue. The two drugs were more comparable on the soft tissue trial on the right. Now, if you go to the next slide, it gets even more wrought. And that's when it comes to the side effect issues that were supposed to be the olocirridine key differentiating points. First, respiratory safety on the left. Now, if you look at that, a 60% decrease in the percentage of respiratory depression certainly sounds good, but you still have about 4% of patients with respiratory depression on the first trial, and you still have 10 or 11% with respiratory depression on the second trial, the Apollo 2 trial. Those aren't, in other words, this drug does not reduce the risk of respiratory depression to the point where it's not a clinical concern. On the right side, you've got the GI effects, the nausea and vomiting. I think it's even clearer here that the 0.35 dose, which is the one that does start to approach morphine in terms of efficacy, does not completely reduce vomiting. It's still a very salient in Apollo 1. And while it's not as salient in Apollo 2, look at the amount of antiemetic use. You still have a very high number of patients for whom anti-nausea drugs were required. And I think in the post-op setting, this means they still have to be very carefully monitored, which does not make a pharmacoeconomic case for this drug as being advantageous when it comes to pay or burden.
I think, Harry, I think you're exactly right, and it's something that we've seen looking at things like, you know, the IV NSAIDs, Cadence, Mallinckrodt. They actually made a pretty good case for reducing opioid burden, adding another mechanism, so a multimodal analgesia, and diminishing the time the patient spends in recovery, and because of the things that you're talking about right here. So how do you, I mean, do you think that next generation opioids are the way to go, or do we just need a different mechanism?
Well, I mean, it would...
Not that easy.
Yeah, I mean, trying to find another mechanism that has the brute force analgesic efficacy of opioids so far is elusive. And CARA, which has the kappa opioid antagonist, they've run up against a dose-limiting issue with the increased sodium levels. And we'll have to see if reducing dosing in their phase 3s also costs them significantly in terms of efficacy. But that's, I mean, so far, the gold standard remains gold when it comes to its overall impact on pain. And
want to address pain. I understand. Yeah. It's difficult. So this is the last category of swells, and it's you're going to have to explain what you mean by Invicta. Speed and tolerability, but Alkermes opioid receptor modulator for depression.
Well, this is a program that's gotten quite a bit of press because it does basically combine an opioid agonist with an opioid antagonist, and the premise proposed by Alkermes and others is that this has the net effect of being a kappa opioid modulator, and it's had extensive testing in depression. Now, when I say ambiguous speed and tolerability, I'll just make a note about speed. When they did their first phase 2 several years ago, there was some reference made, at least at ACNP, as to believing that there might be some impact as soon as a week after administration. And, speed of impact in depression has been a long-standing challenge. Waiting 3 or 4 weeks for antidepressant effect has been is highly problematic for depressed patients. The tolerability issues have been, I think, somewhat overlooked because Alkermes, after disclosing their side effect profile for the phase 2 trial in the phase 3 program, has simply consistently said consistent with previous data. So they've actually been a little bit withholding when it comes to the side effect issues. The other problem they run into was that after a surprisingly positive look in phase 2, in their phase 3 programs, they had one that was completely negative due to a very high placebo response. They had another that missed the primary at a single time point. Post hoc analyses yield statistical efficacy, but the FDA is not always responsive to post hoc rehashings. And then they had finally a phase 3 program trial, Forward 5, which did hit the endpoint. And they're planning to file on the basis of one clearly positive phase 3, one ambiguously positive phase 3, and then their previous phase 2 data. Now, the next slide, I think, has the next slide does not exist, but if you, the data from the phase 2 showed a rather intimidating percentage of adverse events. You've got 34% were nauseous, 17% had vomiting, 19% dizziness, and the phase 3s have simply noted safety and tolerability consistent with that reported for earlier studies. So, as painful as depression is, I think adding nausea and vomiting to it is not the most attractive commercial profile, and it's something that, particularly if other programs advance, as we're going to talk about in a little while, it's going to be somewhat difficult to make the commercial case for 5461, other than perhaps for some small subpopulation of depressed patients for whom this particular mechanism is impactful, and trying to identify the likely treatment responders will be a challenge in itself.
So, whoops, don't go there yet. Here I am just doing a time check. We got like 20 minutes, and we got two sections, but we got some really interesting stuff at the back end. So let's run through the question here. Is there swell found in the Alzheimer's roster? And I think everybody wants to know thoughts around that, and we certainly hope so, but I hear from Mr. Robot.
Well, I mean, it's a somewhat sardonic, but I think not inappropriate comment on the way that we've addressed Alzheimer's over the years. And there's plenty of debate that we don't have to rehash here about the amyloid hypothesis and the way that it attracted so much of the research dollars and resources available. And I think the way we framed it has sometimes been off base. Go to the next slide. This is simply a comment on the dynamic. The comforting thing about the amyloid hypothesis is that it offers a well-defined path forward, and I think there is some truth to this. That companies saw other companies pursuing this and thought, we need one too, and at least we know how one proceeds clinically, even though there's been a consistent history of disappointment in the clinic.
Falling off the cliff.
Yeah. The amyloid hypothesis has evolved. The first iteration, the amyloid plaque causes Alzheimer's degeneration, in some ways was resurrected and perpetuated by the development of a PET ligand for identifying plaque deposition, because that sort of sustained plaque as if it was the best marker for Alzheimer's, and there's plenty of debate to be had on that. I think that the underlying concept has evolved so that amyloid in non-plaque forms, soluble oligomers and fibrils, is now, I think, seen more frequently as perhaps a bigger contributor to amyloid pathology. And now the latest iteration is that perhaps amyloid plays a secondary role, setting the stage perhaps for tau-induced degeneration. And all of these remain to be determined. But in spite of that, if this is not a comprehensive roster, but I think it's a fairly illustrative and representative one. These are some of the major Alzheimer's programs, and about 2/3 of them are still amyloid-based. There are, obviously there's been a shift of some resources to tau, and some shift of resources to programs that do not rely upon correctly identifying the single upstream causal event that address neuroinflammation, for example. But still, there is a high emphasis on amyloid, and most of these programs will not produce definitive proof of concept readouts until 2020 and beyond. I think about 1/3 of these have readouts during this decade. For quite a few, we're not going to know whether the current crop of candidates works for several years from now.
So we don't know the answer to that question, but we're still trying. Okay, good. We're at the WAVE section, and there are some really interesting things here. We have it separated into psychiatry and neurology, and in psychiatry, 2 groups here, the rapid-acting antidepressant, well, yes, 2 groups. One is depression and insomnia, which really never turned into a WAVE, and Harry can explain that a bit, but we're going to spend a little more time on esketamine, which is J&J Janssen's NMDA receptor antagonist, which has breakthrough designation for both treatment-resistant depression and depression with the imminent risk of suicide. So truly an acute use and need, high unmet need in these patients. So, Harry, you want to take it?
Well, let me just make a note. Jordan, just briefly note the insomnia angle before we go on to in more detail. I mean, I think, Merck did take the risk of addressing a new mechanism in insomnia, orexin antagonism, a non-selective orexin receptor antagonist. I think one of the issues that is well known is that the FDA, being primarily preoccupied with how people drove the next day, which I think is a bit of a red herring, emphasized a dose, labeled, and it allowed the approval of a dose that Merck itself did not think was going to be all that efficacious. And while prescribers of patients can then escalate the dose, the fact is the first impression of this drug is sometimes one of somewhat of disappointment, because in fact it's a suboptimal dose. And the fact that the FDA approved it, the way they approved it may have actually undermined Belsomra's prospects, and Merck has not broken out those sales results, which tells you they're not that impressive. Now, I think the more interesting programs are I think where we do have a genuine wave coming, and again, it's ironic, it's psychiatry, which has been so unpopular, is in the rapid-acting antidepressants, esketamine, the isomer of ketamine, which is getting a fair amount of off-label use in the field, is going to have its first phase 3 data reported this year, and then more next year. This could be a huge development to have an antidepressant where you know within a couple of hours whether you have a clinical effect. Now, even J&J admits that they have not been able to parse out all of the dissociative effects, side effects that can be problematic with ketamine, which in fact cause ketamine to be a drug of abuse in some sectors. But their phase 2B data suggests that it's time limited, not disabling. It's something that if you have somebody to stay in a doctor's office for a couple hours, that for most patients that seems to be sufficient for ensuring that something more problematic is not developing. So this is, a potentially huge development, particularly if in the second niche that they're trying to address, suicidality, if they can show that in fact basically disassembles the suicidal ideational thread that can become so perseverative for these patients where it's sometimes hard for them to think of anything else.
I agree with you that I think this is a real meaningful shift in the treatment of depression. I do see two things that may be an issue, or certainly the company will have to struggle with. One is, as you talked about, the dissociative effects and potential black box warning or even a REMS, so that would restrict the treatment setting, the treater type, just limit a rollout to a larger patient base. And the other is that the suicidal patients they're treating in the trials are those that are going to the emergency room. And so it's in the acute hospital setting, so it's a hospital budget, which is notoriously tight. And we've seen this in other drugs that are in the hospital setting, that it's a slow rollout. So they're restricting to a setting within a setting, so the ER, and to a particular type of specialist, so a site consult, and then building a case over time for some sort of a pharmacoeconomic benefit to the hospital itself or other avenues. So, I agree, it should be big and important, but there's a lot of things to think about here.
Well, I would just note that those are also two very expensive settings, though. ERs and inpatients, to the degree to which inpatient hospitalization even exists anymore, that's really expensive. So it's not hard to find a pharmacoeconomic benefit if you've got efficacy against suicidality. That's actually not that big a hurdle, because the alternative of having to extend hospitalization or repeated ER visits, those are very costly to payers.
I agree, and those are the things that they'll be tracking.
Right.
Okay, we got 10 minutes, and I'm sure that people won't mind if we go a couple of minutes over, but so this is our Waves in Neurology, where this is really treating the tough-to-treat patients. There are a few that we want to touch on in a little more detail. AveXis, Speranza, which doesn't have its name on there, and then the next generation, AveXis, is that how you say that? The gene therapy for SMA. So you want to talk about this slide, or you want to go straight to AveXis?
Well, let's talk about AveXis, because I think it was a fascinating strategic move that Roche made here. Here they have a drug that dramatically outperformed Rebif head-to-head, and while the other drugs were not on the same docket, it does suggest that it could be a competitor for drugs like Tysabri in terms of efficacy in relapse-remitting. It also showed efficacy in progressive MS, which has been an virtually untreatable category. And it's a semi-annual IV drug, which as much as oral drugs made a big difference in the relapse-remitting MS market, here going to the other end of the extreme, that their IVs, but twice a year, is a considerable advance. And what they did was undercut the pricing of other drugs by 25%. Instead of, like everyone else, going for the maximum price they could get. And I think this was incredibly smart, because now So anyways, why other people haven't thought of this, I don't know, but hopefully it will remind people there's more than one way to achieve commercial success.
Yeah, and that price a discount even with an indication for progressive disease is pretty incredible. This slide I can talk to. It's other companies in the space, particularly Biogen, is taking some quick action as they see this as eroding or taking share from at least two of their drugs, Tysabri and Tecfidera. And I think that that's right. And they're coming back with a couple of things. One is that Ocrevus is an infusion, so it's going to be coming out of a medical benefit as opposed to a self-injectable, which is covered by the pharmacy benefit. This is Merck KGaA. So, you know, it's two different buckets of money, and I think that the one payer is not as concerned about what the other payer's budget looks like or hit to their budget looks like. But then there are certainly big payers out there who have both pharmacy and medical budgets. So it could be a complicated story there. And then on the right side, it's Biogen saying, and they have multiple options or products that for treating MS, all the way from interferon to AveXis to Tysabri. So they can bundle and contract with the payers, but I like their wording, progress on value-based and innovative contracting. So anyway, they're fighting back.
I would just note that if the best that Merck KGaA could come up with was some comment about the different buckets of insurer money, that if that's the best response they can come up with, that deserves an Anderson Cooper eye roll, because that's simply not, it's almost irrelevant.
We'll put a meme on there. Okay, let's talk about Spinraza and the next generation gene therapy. I do have a couple of questions, but you want to walk through the data?
Well, I mean, I think there are two. The data we have is for AveXis, and if you look over to the survival data, you know, it's pretty. I mean, it's from a tiny phase 1b trial, but when you have 9 out of 9 reaching 20 months, 15 out of 15 reaching 13.6 months, event-free. I mean, it's so far we're talking about 100% of the patients receiving this particular gene therapy. I mean, it's you know, they're infants, and they're showing some remarkable effects. Now, I think obviously they're going to have to draw out these trials and expand the patient population, you know, the duration, size of the trials, but that's pretty impressive. And Biogen, which did, I think, shock some people with its going for the gold pricing for Spinraza, it will not be hard for AveXis if they continue to show this kind of data to, first of all, be approved quickly, and second of all, then undercut Biogen's pricing.
Yeah, and we've been talking internally that Biogen, you know, for sure saw AveXis coming right behind them, and with a different, potentially curative, we don't know what the duration of effect is, but it could be pretty significant here, and so maybe they're trying to get out with a pretty high price just to reap what they can before a competitor enters the market. And then I've seen, just in analyst reports, expectations for AveXis of a price tag of anywhere from $1 to $2 million per treatment. But again, we don't know the durability, and we don't know the potential for retreatment. So it's a question, but it's something that we struggle with quite often for gene therapies, and how it's going to be paid for. Is it a lump sum up front? Is it amortized over years? Is it performance-based payments? You know, it's a big struggle for all of these companies, but a wonderful thing for the patient. So that's
it's just a good it's a good problem to have, and we rarely get to say that.
It's a good problem to have. So this is our last wave in pain, and it is the you say C-GRIPS, I say CGRP. We can fight it out after. But maybe we just go to the next one, because I'll let you comment on the mechanism and the promise here, and then maybe I'll talk just for a second about what happens when they get on the market.
Well, it's really the treatment model that I think is the potential advance here, migraine prophylaxis. Now, the fact is none of these injectables appear to, they do not eliminate migraine by any extent, and I think one of the big issues ultimately, when I suspect most of these drugs will make it through phase 3 and will be approved, they'll be fine-tuning the competitive advantages and disadvantages of each, and trying to figure out the actual patient benefit in terms of the percentage by which migraine is reduced on a monthly basis, and how that, and basically competing with addressing those migraines on an acute basis with cheap triptans. And that will again be something that will be probably patients with very unremitting chronic migraine will not be hard to sell to the payers. There will be a large percentage of patients where it will be more contentious. And again, I think there'll be, with 4 of them, there'll be a lot of room for positioning around pricing.
Yeah, I think so too, or it could even be more, call it harsh than that. We've been, like everybody else, looking at the PCSK9 inhibitors. So a situation like that where you have 4 high-priced drugs entering the market, the first one comes out, do they even just wait for the second one to come out before they even entertain where they're going to put it on a formulary? And so they're pitting one against the other for discounts and formulary access. I mean, you can kind of see that same thing happening there, and it may not be as much about data and the differentiation as it will be about differentiating with price and negotiations with the payers. But it will be very interesting. And just one more thing is that we updated this slide, and one thing that we saw is that Lilly's really pushing their program. They've sort of moved ahead. They were behind and moved ahead, and I think they're aggressive with the Collucid, and then they're moving their program to come in and be, who knows if first mover advantage still exists, but moving themselves to be out there first to the market. Harry, we're out of time, but I'm sure that people want to hear about your thoughts on potential waves, so take as much time as you want.
Well, I'm just noting on a few of them. I mean, the glucocerebrosidase in Parkinson's, right now, the first efforts will be addressing a genetically defined group of patients with mutations in that gene, but there's some reason to believe that this may be a target for addressing idiopathic Parkinson's too, that it is a way to address alpha-synuclein production. And that's, I think, a pretty exciting program that's now partnered with Allergan. The Huntington issue with Wave Life Sciences, I think, addressing the increased evidence that there are multiple isoforms of the mutant protein, and each one may require a slightly different gene therapy approach. And that I think differentiates a little bit from the Roche Ionis program, for example, where it's just trying to do reduce the production of mutant HTT, actually just overall reduce HTT production. The Nexon program I like in terms of addressing, being another way of addressing, novel way of addressing inflammation in neurodegeneration, and Alzheimer's is going to be their first target. We briefly addressed glutamate when the Norx Allergan antidepressant program, but it's also interesting target in neuropathic pain. Quartet has BH4, which I think is an interesting program, which is actually optioned to Merck. And finally, Biogen is going to take the anti-LINGO program, piscinumab, ahead in relapse-remitting MS, and if they get the dosing right, that would be the first regenerative therapy in neuroscience, and that would be an interesting wave of itself.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great list, and we'll watch for the data. I know in your publication we have a list of trial dates that we're looking for, so I'm sure those are in there. So to wrap it up, we're kind of back where we started. This slide was in the beginning, talking about good things to come, and we've touched on a lot of these. Some we haven't at all, but we do think that there were special mention as major shifts, potential major shifts in treatment of CNS conditions. So, Harry, I will let you have the last word, but just thank you to everybody out there. There were some questions, and we will get back to you. We'll get back to you by email, or we'll set up a phone call.
Yeah, the last comment I have is that people, I think, sometimes interpret Alzheimer's and the frustrations therein as diagnostic of neuroscience capabilities overall, and that's simply untrue. You know, there were a few years where we didn't make major differences in treatment paradigms, where there were no shifts in what prescribers had available, but this is a list of programs that I think are more likely than not to actually change what is available to patients in these disorders. And by 2020, you've got a fairly lengthy list of disorders for which there'll be valuable new additions. And that's not a bad decade's work done. That's, I think, something that will change how neuroscience is perceived in general.
We agree. So thank you, Harry, and thank you, everybody, for joining, and happy weekend.
Thank you, Ginger.